going on, everybody? Kevin Cole here, Unexpected Points, back with an off-season week in review podcast. Not getting into too much obscure stuff at this point. We have actual news, and we've had a steady trickle, you could say, of actual news over the last few weeks when it comes to contracts, things of that nature. So we have a couple of contracts this week. The Justin Jefferson deal, I think, being significantly more interesting than the Christian McCaffrey extension. I was kind of surprised in a way that McCaffrey's extension came and went without much commentary at all. Maybe there's been a détente, if you will. Pull out some SAT words here. A détente between the running backs don't matter people and the running back truthers, where tip of the cap from the nerds to Christian McCaffrey as being a little bit of an outlier there. And at the same time, not getting too upset about the fact that his extension from running back truthers is not nearly as lucrative, or even in the ballpark, even in the county, the city, the nation, the world of someone like Justin Jefferson. Now he's a bit older, so it's, third contract. That's that kind of deal. Maybe it's a fourth contract, actually. The 49ers might have already restructured him once after the initial deal that the Panthers got. But I think there's been, more of a coming together and an understanding there in running back world. Honestly, we won. They lost, but it's okay. They meaning running back truthers, not running backs. No problem with the running backs themselves, of course. But let's talk Jefferson, because now we're going to get into some stickiness when it comes to what is good, what is bad, some second, third level thinking, and maybe game theory as to what to do. And then when it comes to this contract, I think this is a prime example of how do you view the probability of it being a plus EV type of deal, with the fact that you're not a GM or an owner managing a portfolio of teams where you can pick and choose different contracts and realize, over the course of these 100 different contracts that I'm doing and extensions that I'm doing, some will be good, some will be bad, some will cancel out, some that won't. That would be a much different context when looking at re-signing a super duper star player at a extremely market breaking amount versus you run one team. If you're going to trade away that player, that's a huge move to undertake. And you got to really be confident trading away a superstar player and then not paying them is worth it. Because if things don't go well, everyone's out. It's years of rebuild. Everything's going to rain down upon your head, even if, Justin Jefferson being there or not is not necessarily going to be even as important as whether or not JJ McCarthy ends up hitting. And of course, he has an effect on McCarthy hitting, although I think that's probably a little bit overstated. I think you probably need more surroundings than just a single receiver in order to get there. Anyway, let's get into the details here. I'll just say. So we're gonna talk Jefferson. We'll talk McCaffrey. Then I have some clips from a podcast of football, European, international football, soccer, as we call it here. Actually, they call it soccer in Australia too. I wasn't aware of that. So soccer, as we call it, podcast. And I think it's I like to listen to other analytical thinkers in other sports, not one, because I'm interested in those sports, and two, is to also reflect it back onto football and the NFL and figure out what we know here, because I think often our whole perspectives are very much shaped by the starting point, our frame of reference for how we look at everything. For instance, people will say, the NFL is so complicated. The NFL is not baseball. Well, guess what? If I was analyzing soccer after analyzing the NFL, I would say, well, soccer's not the NFL. Like, it's nowhere close to as analyzable, not a word, but I'll go ahead and throw it in there, as football is in a way. So how do we think about that? Um, anyway, it's a great podcast. So you guys will probably enjoy the clips a little bit, but I'll tell you to dig into it even further. I'd love to do something similar for the NFL, but I'm probably not as knowledgeable into the deep archives of NFL analytics to do something similar because they're going back through history and looking at different analytics. All right, long-winded intro here. Let's get to the Jefferson contract. First of all, it's up here on the screen for those of you watching, and I appreciate your viewership here on YouTube, the Justin Jefferson deal. So we don't want to obscure everything, but let's talk headlines first and then get into some of the specifics. $140 million extension, which comes out to $35 million per year. Big number. Big number. Yet again, if you view it versus maybe an Amon-Ra St. Brown, where I think technically the extension was $30 million a year, you might say, oh, $5 million more a year for Justin Jefferson over Amon-Ra St. Brown. That sounds like a good deal. Well, it's a little more complicated than that. You have a lot more money being rolled into it when we're talking about the fourth year of Jefferson's first round player contract, the fifth year when it comes to the option that's being exercised here versus what we saw for Amon-Ra St. Brown. And the fact that it is this, 3-year, well, I guess 4-year extension here. It's on top of that fifth year option that we had talked about before. And it includes like a void year on the end of this thing. So we have to look at that pretty carefully for how we're going to analyze the money that's coming in here. But technically, it's got, you can look at it as a 5-year sort of deal. So I'm sorry, it's not there's more like the 3-year extension there. So when we look at this though, there's an extra year because of that fifth year option. Now, the difference is though, the guarantee money is massive here. So you have the $88 million guaranteed at signing, where there was nothing close to that. We're talking about tens of millions of dollars higher than anything else that we've seen for another wide receiver contract. You have the 2027 money becoming guaranteed, the $29 million base salary becoming guaranteed in early 2026. So it essentially guarantees all that money also, which is not technically part of the guarantee. So then we're pushing up the de facto rolling guarantee amount up to close to $120 million. And I think the best way to look at this deal is not even to look at it in the context of the wide receiver market, but to look at it in the context of the non-quarterback market. So in the non-quarterback market, the closest thing we would have seen here, and I'll bring this up here, is Nick Bosa's contract from last year. $34 million a year, so pretty close amount as we see there. It extends out a little bit longer than the Justin Jefferson deal because of the fact that it was signed last year and it was an extra year on that amount there. Similar fully guaranteed money, also has the money becoming guaranteed in advance. It has the 2026 money becoming guaranteed a year in advance. So a lot of similarities between these two deals, other than you getting an extra year with Bosa. It was signed a year earlier. So in some ways, it's more valuable because it was signed a year earlier. In some ways, it's less valuable because money is being pushed further out into the future at that point. Now, the thought might be, could the Vikings have done a better deal for Jefferson? Could they have figured out, rather than, let's say, okay, so here's the complications. So the complications were Tyreek Hill, Devontae Adams, I guess AJ Brown to an extent, although it was more like this year's re-upping and re-extension of AJ Brown were problematic for figuring out Justin Jefferson, because there's a lot of like funny business, especially in the Adams and Tyreek Hill contracts as they're aging players. Those numbers that are being reported for 30 APY, in the neighborhood of 30 APY, were all intents and purposes more like 22.5 to 25 APY. So you have Jefferson, who, remember, could have been extended last offseason. You can extend after 3 seasons. So they did not extend him early. So the question would have been, if we would have done this a year ago versus today, could that number have been closer to 30? How much would it have had to top 30 to really top those, albeit fake, numbers that were coming from Tyreek Hill and from Devontae Adams? If it came before the Nick Bosa contract, would matching that have been, did that add difficulties to that? Did that add difficulties bumping it up maybe another 5 million this year based upon the Nick Bosa contract, which came in September of last year? So could they have got it done before the Bosa contract? I think generally they probably could have gotten something done before the Bosa contract that would have cost them less than this amount, maybe got a slight discount for that. So perhaps they should have done that. But obviously, there are a lot of moving parts still going on, figuring out what they're going to do at quarterback, what they're going to do going forward this year, whether they're going to get the rookie quarterback or a rookie quarterback that they wanted in the draft, which obviously opens up a lot of capital to spend on someone like Jefferson when you think about the total spend on offensive weapons. So, waiting probably didn't hurt them that much. But let me just say, if we're looking at this contract versus the Bosa contract. And again, Justin Jefferson, even though he's resetting the receiver market, I'm not that worried about him resetting the receiver market. I'm not that worried about the fact, and Jason Fitzgerald has some good numbers here over at OTC. If you look at like the difference amounts, and if we're looking at straight cash, homie, that he's making above and beyond what he would have made, it's pretty big amounts. I mean, it comes out to, what is that? 22 million more than Amon-Ra St. Brown or Jalen Waddle through year 3. Let me see, about 16 million more through, well, actually almost 20 million through 1 year more than anyone else. About 16 million to 20 million more than anyone else through year 2. A little bit over 20 million through year 3, and then at least 20 million more than everyone, including Amon St. Brown, through year 4. And St. Brown doesn't have the guarantees on the end there. So that number, like if you're going to say Amon-Ra St. Brown, is he really going to pull in $36 million in cash? There's some more questions as to whether or not that will happen. Some more questions as to what some of these other guys will be pulling in late in their deals. So it's a big step up. It's a big step up. Now, it's probably worth it though. If your baseline was to say that the receiver market was a rational market, and the deals that we've seen on the young players like Amon-Ra St. Brown, Jalen Waddle, A.J. Brown, that those deals were rational deals. I'm not sure that's the case. Then I think you can look at it and say, oh, it's not, it's not too bad for a receiver market. Whatever Jamar Chase ends up getting, if he ends up getting incrementally less than this amount, if CeeDee Lamb ends up getting incrementally less than this amount, I still think you would be very happy if you had Justin Jefferson instead of those guys. Those guys are great receivers. Less consistency so far in their careers, less upside, less prove it no matter what the situation is. I mean, for instance, for my plus minus numbers, and I'll discuss this briefly. So for my plus minus numbers on these guys, and sorry, I don't have a graphic for this. I'm just looking in my R Studio here to pull this up. So for Justin Jefferson, since he's come into the league, his total ranking in plus minus, he was 15th as a rookie, but he was 4th in per game. I'm sorry, no, I'm looking at this incorrectly. Hold on, let me sort the stats. He was 6th as a rookie, 5th in per game, 4th and 4th the next season, 1st in total plus minus last year, 3rd in per game. And then last year he was 15th in total plus minus, but 4th per game. So if you look at that per game number, and obviously there's really, really high volume with him. There's good quarterback play from Kirk Cousins, but not outstanding quarterback play from Kirk Cousins. There was bad quarterback play from others last year outside of Kirk Cousins. When you have a guy who 4 straight seasons, and even after 3 straight seasons, again, this is why I would have been willing to give him the bag last offseason, is giving you like top 5 per game, pretty much top 5 overall numbers as long as he stays healthy, which he didn't last season. But, I don't think it's anything to be worried about it being a sticky feature going forward, that he's going to continue to get injured. when you have those sorts of numbers, that really like extends you head and shoulders above the rest of the world. Now, the only other receiver for me who compares to Justin Jefferson in value, in likely value, is Tyreek Hill. But of course, Tyreek Hill is a lot older. Tyreek Hill, as far as a per game number for his value, has been first the last 2 years, was ninth before that, then third, 11th, third, ninth. So even then, not showing the consistency early career that we saw from Justin Jefferson. But definitely over the last few years, I would say he probably has been even more valuable than Justin Jefferson in a way, but also, not being used in nearly as high of a volume. Jefferson's been a higher volume route runner. And Jefferson's a young guy, right? Came out after his junior year, a young junior when he came out. So we're not getting an old prospect. We're getting the best years of his career right there. So, like, no one's really close, in my opinion, to these two guys. I would put these two guys in their own bucket. CeeDee Lamb, if we look at what CeeDee Lamb has been able to do in his career, if we look at his per game rankings for plus minus in my numbers, 28th as a rookie, 22nd in his second year, 8th and 2nd last year. So he did have a big step up in the last 2 seasons. Still, I wouldn't put that in the category, and massive volume for him. I wouldn't put that in the category of being on the same level or even close to the same level in consistency that we hope for from Justin Jefferson. CeeDee Lamb was 6th last year in his passing plays that he was involved in of any receiver in the league. So just very, very high. That's how he gets up to those high numbers. Partially it's volume induced. And I think you do have to look at things like ADOT and other situations to see, what's the replaceability of this type of player. It's kind of what I talked about when it came to Amon-Ra St. Brown a little bit, and why I had some skepticism there. So the other guy is Ja'Marr Chase. So I think Ja'Marr Chase is closer to a Justin Jefferson prototype, but even still, he's someone whose numbers have gone down over time. He was someone who was top 5 in plus minus per game as a rookie. Then it went down to being more in the 15 sort of range, and then 19th last year, which isn't bad considering quarterback play and the fact that Burrow wasn't there. But at the same time, the quarterback play efficiency-wise wasn't that bad without Joe Burrow last year, which was a little bit of a head scratcher, and I think has fed into some idea that Joe Burrow might not be as valuable as you think. The fact that last season, after Burrow went down, Burrow wasn't that great, right? When he was playing, he had some issues with injuries, and then he came back and this and that. So Burrow wasn't fantastic while he was playing. He had some good games that he started to come around on. Then you had Jake Browning come in there and be, okay. TD rate, 4.9% TD rate, not fantastic, but not bad. Yards per completion for Browning, 11.3. That's pretty good. Not a lot of yards per game, not a huge volume for him, but he did okay. A QBR of 60 for Jake Browning versus a 51.6 for Burrow last season. So, in a lot of ways, Jefferson without Kirk Cousins was dealing with bigger issues than Chase. So I think Chase with this defensive shift that we saw, the way defenses had changed as far as taking away the explosive plays, there was an element of Chase's game that was unsustainable as far as the explosive plays were concerned anyway as a rookie. And then I think also the defensive shifts that we've seen has had a larger effect. He's less defense proof. He's less scheme proof than maybe someone like Justin Jefferson, who just chugging along before and after this tectonic shift in defenses and how they play against wide receivers. So if Chase is going to get a number, because they're not going to re-sign Higgins, that's close to or right in the same ballpark with matching the metrics of Jefferson, I think that's going to be a lot worse, almost unquestionably worse for the Bengals than this Jefferson contract. Or not as good for the Bengals as the Jefferson contract is for the Vikings. Now, if you want to look at the negative side of this, if you're going to make a negative case for this, and I think you can, but again, this is more of the perspective where we're widening out and we're saying, I'm portfolio managing all 32 NFL teams, and I can decide what I want to do here and there. And if half the, if 35% of the teams blow up in my face and 65 are better than they would have been, then I'm a success. Well, you can't do that on every team, right? You're the GM of one team. So like trading him away is not necessarily the best option. But if you think about like versus Nick Bosa, what is working against you? And I think that's probably the case that we want to bring out here. We have a pretty long history, which has not really been debunked, I don't think in any way, that pass rusher is a tier 1 non-quarterback position. We can isolate the play. It translates well from college to the pros. So that's one reason, which is not really applicable now as much because we've seen them in the pros. So if we've seen Justin Jefferson be good in the pros, that takes away some of the discount. But even still, when they move from team to team, which gives you a little bit of a window into the like inherent specific value proposition of a particular player, that translates normally better, pass rushing versus receivers. Sometimes switch teams and it all blows up. Now, a lot of times in the past, it's been older receivers who may have been falling off a cliff anyway, but more recently, we have seen younger receivers get traded and do extremely well after they've been traded. So there's evidence on both sides of that. But the fact that we have seen receivers get traded and do very well after being traded does open up another avenue of acquiring them via trade that maybe wouldn't have been there in the past. A lot of these guys are lower draft picks. I mean, Nick Bosa was the, best player in the draft, despite going second overall in the draft that year, versus Jefferson was someone who ended up sliding into the 20s. So there's, we talk about replaceability on a larger standpoint. Not that you can replace Justin Jefferson, but at least you have a shot of getting him at a much lower cost basis when it comes to draft value. And I think if you're just going to look at trend analysis, and if you don't have a super compelling reason to believe that recent trends are justified, then probably betting on some sort of regression to the mean growth amount of the salary cap is a good general bet. Now, it wouldn't have worked with running backs, right? If you would have said, running back contracts went down a lot from Adrian Peterson's earth-shattering deal in 2014 to 2020. So therefore, in 2021, those guys should be great values because it hasn't kept up with the cap. Well, no, obviously that would have been a mistake, but we have a lot of evidence, right, that they were behind the curve for a long time on running backs. So it wouldn't apply there. Do we have a ton of evidence that people were behind the curve on wide receivers versus edge rushers? Maybe. I mean, you might be able to make the case for that, but it's not as clear cut as when you have a player who predominantly is like a running back who's predominantly gathering counting stats in a lower value aspect of the game, running the ball, which is much more dependent upon offensive line and other players than if you have players like a wide receiver and a pass rusher who are both affecting the biggest part of the game, passing the ball, whether it's the opponent passing the ball or you passing the ball, your offense passing the ball. So I don't see a great thing there. And then if you look at that amount, we had quite a bump up in pass rushing contracts a few years ago. It was really Joey Bosa who was the big bump in this kind of non-quarterback sort of contracts, but it hasn't been extreme, the growth since then. And let me see, that Joey Bosa contract, let's look this up so I have the amounts here. So Joey Bosa contract, he did a restructure, so that kind of messes up my numbers a little bit here. But if you look at the original extension, so it was in 2020, so 4 years ago, 3 years before his brother, effective APY of $25 million a year. And that was a lot at that point. Believe it or not, that was like a big jump in the market. So we have seen from 25 to 34 with Bosa. So that's been a big jump. But if we're going to go back to what were the biggest receiver contracts in 2020, let me see. I don't even know if I can find this. So 2020 contract extensions, NFL wide receiver, what would have been the big amounts? Of course, they're all just giving me like Justin Jefferson's deal. They're not going back to 2020. Um, but if we're going to look back at what those deals were, sorry, I got to do some work here on the old search. Okay, let's go back to 9/1/2020. Okay, let's look at these amounts. So Julio Jones, 22 million per year. Keenan Allen, 20 million a year. So less, pretty significantly less than this amount. And Julio Jones, let's remember, like, let's think about Julio Jones versus Joey Bosa as a player. Julio Jones, perhaps, and I don't think it's hyperbole to say that, he could be the best wide receiver, and, it depends on where you want to rank Tyreek Hill and some others. Could be the best wide receiver. I don't know. Could you make the argument he's the best wide receiver since Jerry Rice? Maybe. I mean, he didn't score touchdowns. So poor Julio Jones. Fantasy bros know that he did not score touchdowns. But I don't know. He's pretty good. I mean, Antonio Brown's pretty good, but I'm taking, the physical phenom and absolute yards per target destroyer of Julio Jones over even Antonio Brown during their primes. But anyway, my point would be like, we say Julio Jones earning 22 million a year versus Joey Bosa at that point in time was earning 25 million a year. Like, Julio Jones was better than the corresponding average or elite or all-time great receiver in that sort of category versus Joey Bosa, right? We're not like Joey Bosa, like there was a thought that he could be great, he could be a great player, but people weren't like, he wasn't being fitted for a Hall of Fame jacket at that point in time, and it clearly isn't now. So you have a bigger gain over the last several years in wide receivers off of a higher player floor in the past. So that shows you that, like, let's say the equivalent of a Joey Bosa at wide receiver, let's say he would have been making like the 20 million a year, the 18 million a year that some of these other guys were. So that's going from 18, 20 million up to 35 now with Justin Jefferson versus the Bosa jump going from 25 to 34. I mean, that's a big, big difference. So we are in an environment where, if you're going to look at the difficulty, like, of the tiering of the positions, you would lean towards edge rusher versus wide receiver, like where you can draft these guys, whether they're available via trade, and maybe even if you can get credible play in free agency, although it's pretty hard wide receiver to get credible play via free agency. And you look at the inflation of the wide receiver market and the fact that you're paying a premium based upon these inflated Devontae Adams and Tyreek Hill deals, which are not real deals. You combine all that together, you could say, at least vis-a-vis the Joey Bosa contract, which is how this contract came together, the Justin Jefferson deal is probably overpriced versus that. Now, you could think that Justin Jefferson to wide receivers is better than Joey Bosa to edge rushers so much more that it makes it justified. But I think it's really just the market dynamics playing this stuff out more so than any kind of like really minute differences in the player valuations vis-a-vis their positions. So that would be the downside case for Jefferson, is that you're paying top market rates off of a market that's had higher than average inflation over the last several years. Unjustified, I would say, in a way, because of the Adams and the Hill contracts not being real contracts. So that would be the downside. But like I said, if you're the Vikings, what else are you going to do? The other downside for the Jefferson deal is just risk in the fact of, if J.J. McCarthy doesn't hit, I do think there's more of a synergistic effect between wide receiver and whoever their quarterback happens to be and the passing offense. Like, they are more dependent on that in a way. How often are they passing the ball? Who are the other options that they have at wide receiver? What quarterback do they have there? I mean, we've seen, like whether it's Marvin Harrison with Peyton Manning back in the day or Randy Moss with Tom Brady, you see how like the sum of their parts, they're greater than the sum of their parts, right? When two of these guys get together and you get the synergy effect. What is that effect for an edge rusher? I don't know. I think edge rushers are more on an island and can really aren't as affected. They're affected somewhat by the quarterbacks who they're playing against. But again, that's a random assortment of quarterbacks who are going to come in, not one offensive system or one defensive system that they're playing with that's going to affect their numbers that much. And there's more randomness just to performance. But if we can look at pressures and things like that, because we only have sacks to judge, let's say, in a hard way, what edge rushers do. So the other risk with Jefferson would be J.J. McCarthy doesn't hit or doesn't hit as well. You're not getting that synergistic effect from Jefferson that makes him really worth that much. Whereas if he was paired with a top-notch elite quarterback, that effect would go through the roof. Or someone who can at least take advantage of him. Maybe like how Tua's kind of take advantage of Tyreek Hill in a way, even though he's not a great quarterback. Maybe that could also happen with J.J. McCarthy. Okay, so that's all I got for Jefferson. Hopefully people appreciate that one. Now let's get to Christian McCaffrey. Again, this one really went under the radar for me as far as commentary. So I don't know if I even have any great takes on this one. They're freeing up some money, right? So let's go to the deal here. So they're freeing up some money. He's only going to have a $6.2 million cap number this year, $9.8 million next year, 11.9 the year thereafter. So all pretty chill numbers, right? And then it jumps up to 27.5 million after that. We'll see. Yeah, that's the we'll see portion of this contract. 19 million per year. Not bad when you consider the fact that he was very high up there in my plus minus numbers in the range of Tyreek Hill, not as good as Tyreek Hill. So very, very valuable to this team and somewhat of a unicorn. And maybe the 49ers, people tell us over and over again that we got these unicorn type of players, but they never end up being there. Well, unicorns only happen once, right? Like the UNI, that means one. That's one of my pet peeves is calling someone a unicorn, meaning they're like good or they're unique. That means one. That means one of a kind, not, different, not like tier one, but it means they're one of a kind. So, he more than anyone else kind of fits that mold a bit. So you can't be that upset about the fact that the cap charges are going to be pretty low for an extended period of time. And we're talking about until he's 30 years old here. Now, are there more issues here with how this might pile up? I don't know. I don't see any notes here with how it'll work. It says if he's on the roster the 5th day of the 20. Oh, that's an old note for the old contract. So I don't know. Maybe there's some additional guarantees that'll pull into place, but it looks like the 49ers downside here is really beyond the next 2 years is really just having to eat the prorated signing bonuses that are going out into void years and the prorated option bonus that's going out into void years. So they're pushing some chips in here with this contract. It's fine, whatever, who cares? And I mean, the risk for McCaffrey would just be because he is a running back and we're talking about a 28-year-old that he would fall off significantly in the next 2 years. But I don't think that affects a guy who catches passes quite as much. Can't be certain of it, but I don't think it affects him quite as much as some other players. So I don't have any great hot takes. Someone was saying they're waiting for me to flame the McCaffrey contract. I mean, what are you going to do in this era of the NFL? I'm actually a little bit surprised it's not quite a bit higher, but they are throwing some money at him. So why not take that money? If you look at the history of the deals, again, the last extension that we got was effective APY is pretty low because of the fact that they rolled it over again. But the APY is 16 million from there. So now it goes up to 19, but it's pretty low when we're talking about in comparison to wide receiver contracts. Okay. Now for the next portion here, I want to talk about a podcast that I was listening to. It is called, let me make sure I have all the information correct on this. So the podcast is called Postscript. It has let me pull it up. Postscript podcast. I think there's a Substack. Yeah, here it is. There's a Substack for this. And if you're looking for regular content, if you're looking for regular podcast content, don't go to this podcast. Because if you look at this, it's pretty hilarious because I found this after they had done episodes 1 through 7. So I didn't, it's like The Sopranos back in the day where you're waiting between seasons for 18 months for something to happen. If you look at the timing of these podcasts, it's pretty hilarious. Like episode 1 happens September 12th, 2020. 22. A week later, episode 2 is out. Then we're talking about a month later, episode 3 is out. So we got starting to slow down a little bit. Then it's, let's see, that's 1, 2, 3, 4, 4.5 months later for episode 4. Only 12 days later for episode 5. So congrats there. Then between March and August, so let me do some quick math, 5 months there. And then another 4 months, 5 months, 4 months into the last episode. And then between the last episode and this episode, it's gone from November 10th of last year until June 4th of this year. So it's not, these are not coming out regularly, suffice it to say. But I love this podcast and I like it a lot because I love soccer. So that helps. It's 2 Americans doing this podcast. One of them is John Muller, who does excellent work at The Athletic. And then another one is anonymous writer, Teodo Football. And I don't know if he's ever been identified, but that's the other person there is part of this thing. Both 2 thoughtful guys. I like hearing them talk. I think Americans have a better perspective when it comes to analytics, the Moneyball, baseball, all that sort of stuff. So they're talking about that there, but they're also heavily focused on different tactics and how tactics and analytical writing has progressed, and going back historically, doing some pretty cool forensic work on this podcast, actually digging up old blog posts which have been deleted off of the internet, because especially this happens in soccer, and I think it happens in a lot of other sports too, is good analysts end up getting snapped up by companies that either deal with proprietary data with teams or teams themselves who now don't want their old analysis on the internet. So they've gone through a bunch of stuff there, whether it's tactics or pure analytics sort of blogging and how it built up through time. This most recent episode that they have, that I've clipped a couple of things from, is about a blogger who was blogging actually from their BlackBerry. So that gives you a little context on how long ago we're talking about here, who brings into play kind of just regression to the mean, which sounds like a pretty simplistic way of looking at things, and maybe something that should have been talked about a bit more. But again, we're going back to, I don't know, I think it's 2011 or something like that, when this stuff was being written, and looking specifically at his local hometown football club, soccer club in England, which had been really, really bad for the first 20 games of the season, and then had won, I think, had 6 wins and a draw over the last 7 games of the season. And looking at different information to figure out, okay, what should we expect going forward? Which in a way was a little bit different than some of the earlier analytical work that had been going on. There's analytical work that was posted publicly by Ian Graham, by Sarah Rudd, other people who became, Ian Graham is instrumental and well known for being part of Liverpool and their success there. Sarah Rudd worked for a company, I think, Stats Perform, which ended up, am I getting that wrong? I might be getting that totally wrong, what the company's name is. But anyway, they were gobbled up by Arsenal, so working there and now doing other stuff, where they were looking at more of quantifying tactical things when it came to different movements of the ball, different passing, things like that. And now what this blogger, who's part of this episode here, is it ports over from hockey the fact of, let's just look at shots and just do simple shot analysis. What are the averages for shots? How many shots happened? What went in? What didn't go in? What do we expect for regression? And that kind of changed the course of soccer analytics to really focus on this sort of stuff going forward, and focus less on what they call in this episode the more interesting stuff, when it comes to how the tactics of everything else leading up to the shot, the process leads up to the end amount. But anyway, a couple of different clips from this episode stirred up some thoughts for me for how I want to think about football, NFL analysis, because of the fact that I think it's good sometimes not just to take all your ideas from more analytically inclined sports processes like baseball and then port them over to the NFL and say everything matches up 1-to-1 and let's be super confident in our conclusions, because there is more uncertainty here than there was. And this is kind of what happens here, is a lot of the ideas were ported in from hockey to soccer, where they actually had more value in hockey, more certainty in hockey, more applications to individual players in hockey than they did to soccer. And thinking about that. So, like, listening to soccer's issues, listening to a sport that is less certain, in my opinion, and I think probably by anyone's opinion, than NFL football, it does help put some perspective on like what we need to be thinking about generally, even if it has less of, even if there are less issues and less problems with NFL analysis, what we need to be thinking about to take our analysis to the next level and not get sucked into just reading out EPA numbers and things like that, but doing it in a good faith way, not putting nerds in lockers and dismissing what they're saying and all this sort of stuff that some other people will try to do, and overvaluing all the tactical coaching sort of stuff, but have a healthy perspective, take perspectives from different areas to come up with, try to uncover, right? Try to reveal the truth. I've been doing this, this philosophical studying, and there's some interesting stuff about Plato and Heidegger and some others who are into that, where Heidegger is really talking about like the truth is really the unconcealment, the deconcealment. I don't know how you would say it. The truth is like it's not your perception. It's shifting how concealed the truth is or not to you. So this helps do that in a way to think about these different ways. Anyway, now that I've probably lost half the people here listening, let's go into it. Let's listen to the clip. I'll stop it as I'm going along, and I'll kind of describe what my thoughts and feelings were and how to apply it and all that stuff. So this is the first clip where I think it's talking about the thing that I mentioned where the shift in blogging going from higher technical sort of stuff where, for instance, Sarah Rudd did a Markov chain where it was Markov chain type of analysis, looking at different passes and how the value of every single pass means something, and trying to value different actions. Whereas the shift here was now to say, rather than just valuing actions, let's try and look at like what's predictable or not, and how that shift ended up affecting soccer analysis and how we can think about it again. I'll apply it back to football.
One thing that's interesting to me, looking back on all those old posts, is the sort of questions those writers, those bloggers, those analysts are asking. What's the value of a pass from the center of the pitch to the wide corner?
And what would it even mean to have value in soccer, right?
Yeah, how do you measure value, right?
Okay, just for a little background. So it's Toyota Football's talking first. It's John Mueller coming in. And when he's saying the old analysis, he's talking about the Sarah Rudds, the Ian Grahams, that they were looking at this sort of stuff first, but then they disappear because they get gobbled up by teams and others. And then where the analysis goes.
Yeah. What does that mean? And or is it better to take corners short or long? Player decision making. Should a player shoot in this situation or pass? And then with those questions come all the sort of need for data and additional context. So what's going on in the game?
This is an important point here. Need for data, because like, okay, so we're gonna do an analogy here. It would be, rather than looking at the play-by-play EPA results, it's looking at what's happening within the play. The problem is we just don't have great data for looking at that. We have a lot of film hipsters who will look at that sort of stuff, but can they value it? Do they know what's replicable or not? Do they know what's sticky or not? I don't know. It's pretty tough. It's tough stuff going on there. There is tracking data, and I think tracking data is opening up a world of things for people on the inside of the NFL, but there isn't for us. And tracking data has become much more available on the outside to the public when we're talking about soccer than when we're talking about the NFL in some ways. But we have a lot better event data, because it's like, if in soccer, after every single time you completed a pass, everyone, they blew the whistle, everyone lined up again, and then they tried to complete another pass, and then everyone stopped and lined up again, then you could get some pretty good passing data for exactly how to value the passes in soccer. But when you have a Markov chain saying if you pass from point X to point Y, what is it worth? It's going to say, well, getting closer to the goal is worth more, even when, as building up is not necessarily the case. So I think that the missing data in the NFL is still a big problem when we're talking about valuing it up. But we have a lot of really, really, really good event point A, point B, we stop, we run a play, and then we run another play where everything starts from a new equal beginning point. Really a lot better there than what we're talking about in soccer.
But the idea is, if something's happening in soccer and we want to figure out why, like a team is better than another team, let's say, or they're winning, and we want to figure out why that is, what drives that, and can we allocate it to players? Can we assign it and attribute it to players or coaches? These are all the important soccer questions we continue to wrestle with today. But one of the questions, whether it's Sarah or Ian or Chris or Howard,
again, these are the old analysts, Sarah Rudd, Ian Graham, and so forth,
or others, what they're not asking, at least publicly that I can tell in large volumes in their blogging, is what I'm seeing attributable to anything.
Attributable to anything.
Yeah, that's kind of a stump sort of question. Is it attributed to anything? But we'll see an elaboration here. It's basically saying, like, how do you attach that to your ability to predict based upon that? Which, prediction, and this is what I think is interesting about general sports analysis. Like, we're all kind of in the prediction business, and I may have discussed this before in the podcast, so I apologize if I'm repeating myself here. But I think it's worth going over this again, just to edify this idea. Is that, like, we generally do not care what someone's quarterback rankings are as a purely backwards looking exercise. We kind of care to see how good they're going to be in the future. Most people are doing either explicit or implicit predictions when we're discussing something. So that's when it's taking data, it's taking results. And that's what we have to do. There's two different parts of good analytical work, good work, period. One, measuring results. Two, figuring out where it's attributable to as far as players are concerned, and even more importantly, what's attributable to luck, to variance versus the player, and how much does that change on a player-by-player basis. So that's what maybe somewhat inarticulately what Teodo Football is trying to get across here.
Yeah, so there's a goal that was scored, right? Or a shot that was created, or a shot was put on target, and StatDNA, and they've got models to value what is the sort of the goal value associated with putting the ball from your foot into the corner of the goal mouth, right? Or versus off target, right? And missing the goal entirely. What's the value of finding that shot instead of finding some other pass or turning the ball over? But what I don't see a lot is this thing that's happening that I'm trying to value. Does it mean anything? Will it recur, or is it just something I've observed happen?
Now, this is a big one. This is a big one. And I think this is talking about, again, turning an analysis into a prediction. And I think this is one of the biggest problems when it comes to expert analysis on anything, especially the NFL, and what it means for the fact that these guys are all doing explicit or implicit predictions, is that they know a thing happened. They can analyze that the thing happened, but is it a thing going forward? And then you have to start to say, well, maybe there was more luck in this than we thought. Maybe different people were more dependent upon this situation than we may have thought. And that also is a problem with a numbers-based analysis, but at least if we collect many, many, many type of situations, and if we have the ability to isolate those situations, and that's what's very difficult in soccer, because every situation is so different. You don't, again, you don't blow the whistle, put the ball on the field, line everyone up, and go again. Can you kind of predict the stickiness of this sort of performance going forward?
And
will it recur?
Yeah.
When we say does it mean anything, or is it attributable to anything, we're saying, is there some underlying cause for the events that happened in last week's game that will cause that same thing to happen in next week's game?
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, because I think the starting point for all soccer fans is kind of like, my team won. Okay, let me figure out why. Or my team lost and I'm pissed about it. Let me figure out why.
Okay, this leads directly into one of my pet peeves about all sports analysis, especially NFL analysis, is that the main form of NFL content will be teams playing really well, Let me tell you why team is even better than you thought. Team's playing poorly, and let me tell you why team is even worse than you thought. Where directionally, those are both more often than not wrong takes. But it's what people want to hear, and it's what they lean into. So that's why people lean into it, which again, bad predictions most of the time.
In both cases, the answer is the coach, by the way.
Yeah. Well,
Yeah, coaches don't matter. They're on that. They're on that wavelength, which I appreciate.
I could go on this whole rant right now. I was
Not specifically, coaches don't matter. You know what I mean? Matter less than you think.
thinking about the other day about how our experience as fans must always involve the possibility for our team to improve. And so when they're not playing how we want them to, and they never are, because the whole identity of fandom is we need them to exceed it at some point and like win the title. We aspire for our teams to like win everything, but they currently don't. That experience necessitates a story in our head at all times of what could be better, and
it necessitates an irrationality, I think, also that goes into fandom.
And what do we need to change to get there? And if you're not in a transfer window, you can't get new players, so it's always the coach. It's all.
Yeah, this would be a similar thing. Like when you're in a season, you're not going to get new players, so coach team outperforms expectations, coach good, team underperforms expectations, coach bad. Is that true? Nobody knows.
You're casting soccer as an aspirational endeavor. I would look at the flip side of that and say it's mostly a sport about disappointment.
Yeah, well, but you can only bear the disappointment if you hold a story in your head about aspiration. Which is just toxic, because then you turn around and you have to blame the coach all day long because he didn't play the formation you wanted, or he didn't play the player you wanted, or he's got to go because something. But yeah, I digress. You're right. So we watch soccer and we go, this thing happened. Why did it happen? And what caused it? And the blogger that I want to start with today.
Okay, so that's really the thing is. So you're talking about this is more of a shift, which seems pretty remarkable that there was actually a shift by this guy, James Grayson, of looking at his Lincoln City League Two team to shift them and try to figure out what is going to happen with this team, which has become most of NFL analysis. And that's what Teodo Football mentions here, where I felt as if I was in the crosshairs here for saying how much analysis is just team is better than we think, team is worse than we think, and the problems with that. I think it's more of a problem for soccer because it's harder to measure than it is for the NFL, but it's at least something to think about. And he talks about that here.
This idea of they're running hot, and I think they're going to come back to earth. That today is like, I don't know, 80% of the soccer posts that use any kind of statistics. I feel like that's the most common take. If you need I'm not naming names.
Yeah, he's basically, I'll name myself. That's me.
If you need to like write a post about and use some numbers, you could do a far worse, or tweet out like, hey, this team's got XG of X, which is basically shots with some other stuff, right? But their results are way higher than that, or way worse, and I think they're going to get better or worse. Like 80% of fights that involve any kind of soccer analytics adjacent stuff is whether a team is being lucky, unlucky, hot, cold, etc. But this older way of thinking, which is like also somehow state of the art, goes away. And on my read, at least, and I don't know if I'm right, hockey analytics is kind of like this guardian angel to push it along towards shot metrics and fighting about whether a team is being lucky or unlucky.
Okay, maybe I'll give you a little bit of background here. So the thing is, Grayson used this, I forget what it was, PDO or something like that. It's a metric. I'm not familiar with hockey analytics, so I apologize. Where it's basically just saying, okay, shots go in on an average rate of X. There's so many shots. The variance, you've been running hot or running cold. Let's just look at the shots, and we can come up with pretty well how likely a team is to progress or not. And he was applying that over to soccer. Now, the problem is, and I think some major people in the soccer field have talked about applying this over to soccer, is shots are a better measure in hockey than they are in soccer. There are more shots on target. Less time is spent in the quote unquote build up. There's not a lot. You're just racing as quickly as possible to get forward and to shoot. So like possession isn't as big of a thing. You can have lots of possession and potentially get some good chances that you barely miss in soccer, where that's not really going to happen in hockey. So by porting over something from hockey to soccer, which is a really, really good metric, and also a good player evaluation metric, because you have different player substitutions coming in and out, where you can more accurately, even if you don't understand the specifics of what's going on in a play. This is what I try to do somewhat with my plus minus metric for football. Even if you don't understand the specifics and you can't measure the specifics of what's going on within each segment of play. So it'd be between each shot, let's say, in a game. If you have good on-off metrics, you can estimate the effects, the unseen, unanalyzable effects. I think it's the second time I've used analyzable, which I'm not sure it's a word. Effects that are going on there. So that's what he's talking about, using hockey and bringing it over.
Yeah. Now, in some sense, shots are the only thing that's real in soccer event data. Like,
Yeah.
they're the only thing. They're the only time that we know that a team has definitely done something good or bad. Like, all of this like nebulous mess in the midfield has worked out for some reason, and a like not quite an outcome, but almost an outcome has happened, and it's close enough to an outcome that like we can really say like something has happened in this game.
Okay, so I think there's an analogy here. So like the equivalent of a shot, which doesn't happen that often. Again, a shot on target does not happen that often in a soccer match, and the shots are quite varied where they come from. The equivalent of the only thing that we know that happened in the NFL, the only thing that we know that happened were X number of yards were gained on Y, down, and Z distance. Right? Those are things that we know. And the effect, we know the effect of those. That's what happened. That's the result. Now, how you gain 23 yards on 2nd and 8 from your own 27-yard line, that is up to interpretation, not like you can describe what happened. I get that. You could say, oh, it was a pass from the quarterback to the wide receiver. But there are like a billion different micro events that are going on during that play. So sorting and labeling and figuring out what the important things are and how much to attribute to one versus another, it's just really, really hard. Now, luckily for football analysis, we have, 100 different plays in combination between the two different teams in a game. So we can measure those 100 different things and get a pretty good idea versus shots. We don't have nearly as much in soccer. But again, that's the only thing that's real in a way, that is that we've stripped out via EPA. We've stripped out the interpretation of how much it's worth. Now, a big problem with, football coaches in the past is they were overvaluing success rate versus yards gained, EPA gained on play. So they felt just as good about a 5-yard run on 2nd and 5, which happens, 80% of the time. They felt just as good about that as they did about a 12-yard pass game, which happens 60% of the time, which they shouldn't have, because the latter category is worth a lot more on average, and will lead to a lot more points. So we have that, and again, shots would be the same thing in soccer. But do we want to base everything on the thing that we know the most? Do we want to base everything off of EPA? And some of the thoughts here, I think, are good to bring into the analysis, even when it comes to the NFL.
It's a great way of putting it. It's beyond an indicator of possession.
Yeah.
It's a real outcome. It's the end of a process. It's truly the outcome of a process you put in place.
Again, the yards gained on that down, or the results of that down, is the outcome of the process, each process. So we get a lot of these processes in the NFL.
That's right. But as Juan Malillo likes to remind us, the process is the interesting part. That old quote.
This is a great quote, by the way, coming up
from the Sid Lowe interview. What's the quote? He says something to the effect that the rate of childbirths is an interesting statistic, but the process that led to that is the interesting part.
That's so good.
And soccer's the same way. The process is the enriching part. Nobody goes to the stadium in the 90th minute, looks at the scoreboard, and turns around and goes home happy that they've seen all they need to see.
Okay, so that's the two different clips I had from there, and I think it's good to hear that even though, like I said, there's massive differences between football analysis and soccer analysis. I think that is a lot more important to know or to rely on the data and these play-by-play numbers that we have, because we have that hard data in NFL that we don't have in soccer. But at least it's a good thing to think about, like the process and how do we get to that. Now, I really wish we had more of the tracking data public that we could really dig into on this stuff. And I think that's where things are going to go. But at the same point in time, what we can still do, and this is something that I apply to when I'm watching soccer also, and I think that we can apply when we're watching football, is we can still like reveal, uncover, unhide, the unconcealment of the truth. We can still do that without having to use the specific analytical numbers. Remember, the analytical numbers are just the best tool for doing some of this, for learning some of this, and that's why we use it. We're not like need to use numbers, but the numbers are the best tool, so we're going to use that. So there is the ability, I think, and at least I think, is even as a soccer fan, I think even probably as an NFL fan, just watching certain plays, you can start to get an idea. And maybe you could even, this when it comes to tracking event data and other things, start to get an idea of what get a better idea of the patterns that we're seeing. That's like the truth, or like the different patterns that we're going to see repeat themselves within these plays, which then you can peel back to get to the core of the results. And that's why, just from watching a game, quite often I'll be able to align my thinking on what happened in a game with what my numbers will say afterwards for which team was better or not, without even having to go through the numbers, because we just start to learn and reveal that sort of stuff. So anyway, interesting pod. Go check out Postscript Pod if you want to learn a lot about soccer analytics and other things. And also, it's a good reminder every now and again not to forget totally about the process when we're looking at this and how we can look at that. And I'm going to try to look into that some more in my own work, even if it's going to be difficult because we don't have great tracking data. Okay, I'll take a few questions that are here in the chat and then buzz on out of here. Do you think the weak link model maps onto how to build an effective NFL defense? Basically, it's better to have no bad defense. I mean, no bad defensive players. Interesting. The same thing. Weak, but it's basically bad. Okay, there's another question here by the same person who probably elaborates. It's basically better to have no bad players than, say, a great edge rusher, but clear weaknesses that get attacked. Well, I mean, how it's been thought about in the past is that the coverage is the weak link system, the pass rush is the strong link system. So an individual player is going to matter a lot more in pass rush than is going to matter in coverage. Although, having a great coverage player obviously allows you to roll the defense and do other things, which will help out in that manner. So you can't say necessarily, but I think it makes sense that the edge rushers, their market values continued to go up versus defensive backs is not nearly as much. So yeah, defense is probably more of a general weak link system, only because the quarterback is the strongest link of anything, multiples higher than any sort of player. So yes, for defense, it's better. Like if you're going to spam a defensive spending and say, if you had, let's say, $33 million, let's say more than that because the cap's pretty high. Let's say you had 66. I'm trying to do it by a multiple of 11. Let's say you had $66 million to spend on your defense. I'd rather spend $6 million per player more so on defense than if your offense spends $6 million per player. Like that would be a much better defense than it would be as good of an offense if you're going to build up for something like that. So yeah, generally more of a weak link, but then within the actual system of pass rush, more of a strong link. All right, last question on here. How has the slow adoption of new technologies in sports been both good and bad, with a focus on how it impacts gambling in chances of game outcomes or even on the money line itself? I mean, I think that the gambling lines have been pretty good for a pretty long time. And what you find out if you do any sort of modeling on team strength type of numbers, like I try to build into my power rankings, is you can get 98% of the way there without having to have like any sort of fantastic new technology or data or whatever you may need. Now, if you want to be able to come up with things like player props or digging further into that stuff, maybe it's helpful to have some more technologies there. If you want to be betting on more minute instances like in-game betting or on smaller events or on more obscure sort of stuff, yeah, the technologies probably help, but you can get a lot of way there just with your play-by-play EPA data and figuring out stuff and making some adjustments based upon that. But things have had to get better. But the books have a couple different ways of fighting back. One is by employing the same sort of nerdy people themselves to make their lines even better. And two is to shut down betting accounts that are making too much money from them, and directing those winning bettors elsewhere. So they don't have to lose money anymore. So I think it has an effect, but the best thing that you're going to get is non-public information. Still, if you can get any sort of non-public information, whether it's injury information, things like that, I think that's probably still one of the best ways that a winning gambler can sustain over time if they have access to any of that sort of stuff. The legality or ethics of that is another question, but that's probably still the best way. And I think as the technologies work, these books have a lot of money and a lot of stakes built into it. They should be able to keep up or exceed any sort of outsiders, or just pay them off and just bring them in and give them a big fat check that they can just cash every month and not have to worry about the ups and downs of the market. That'll probably always end up how it'll work out, and the books will be able to stay ahead in that way. All right, that's everything for me. Thanks everyone else for tuning in. I hope the sidebar there with the soccer podcast wasn't too out of left field for people. I'll be back at you next week. Again, I'm going to continue with some of these quarterback analysis as we go forward. I updated the improvement index, so hopefully everyone sees that on the site. And we'll try to keep things going during the summer and be ready for the 2024 season. Thanks, everybody. Take it easy.